Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, the myth of a perfect victim.
You need to perform a certain characteristic or a certain set of characteristics to be worthy of my respect, worthy of human rights.
In his new book, author Mohammed el-Kurd challenges double standards for Palestinians. Who is seen as human and who is not? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Mohammed el-Kurd was born and raised in Jerusalem, the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood to be exact, which has been subject to Israeli settler attacks and forced displacement for decades. You may remember in 2009 when half of his family's home was taken over by those settlers, or in 2021 when his sister confronted an Israeli settler who had occupied that same home.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
But you may not know his grandmother, Rivka. So Mohammed, welcome to The Take. You named your first book after your grandmother, Rivka. She was a survivor of the 1948 Nakba. And in your new book, Perfect Victims, you talk about the experience of that first book, how her defiance was watered down to make her seem more resilient than bitter. Can you tell us more about your grandma and how the experience of writing about her helped inspire this new book?
It's interesting to write about like older Palestinian women, or just like writing about a grandmother is like the most cliche thing in writing. But in the case of my grandmother, or I think Palestinian women at large, there is this element of erasure that they have to go through. You know, they've led many of the rebellions, or they have played key roles in many of the rebellions, and yet they are being remembered as, you know, weak, or just people whose life passes them by and things happen in spite of them. You know, they're depicted to be without agency. So that was kind of the catalyst of why I wanted to write it, because it was on the contrary. But it's also it's interesting that you notice that, and I talk about how I kind of editorialized my grandmother, or how I kind of airbrushed her to be non-offensive, when in fact she did not worry about offending anyone. We would have flocks of American tourists and British tourists come to our house, or activists, to see what's going on in our house. And she would tell them, oh, where are you from? You're from England. You should know that your country is the reason for all of this calamity. And she never, feared to ruffle any feathers.
Right. But with those hard edges, why was it important to sand some of those down?
It felt like it was important, but it wasn't important. I think it was actually a disadvantage to airbrush her. But you're told that if she appears, or if you appear as a subject of colonialism, if you appear to be non-offensive, if you appear to be docile, then your chances of seeming worthy of liberation, or seeming worthy of dignity and human rights increase. But that really misplaces the focus. It puts it on you as the subject of colonialism rather than colonialism itself.
Yeah, there's this term humanize, right? But humanize sometimes is used almost ironically, because by humanizing someone, you actually take away their humanity. It sounds like that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, because like the word humanization or humanize is so vague. What does it mean to humanize someone? And when you dig behind the first layer, you understand the meaning of the word to be a human is someone who adheres to a certain civility, a civility that is defined by Western values, a civility robs them of any kind of agency, a person who is all loving, all forgiving, all generous, who turns the other cheek, who will not defend themselves, who will not feel disdain towards their oppressors. But that is not a human. That is a reduced shell of a person. That is someone who is flat, who is one-dimensional. Human is someone who encompasses all of the traits, right? It's quite basic. And I think this is a quite basic argument that people would agree with in theory. But to see it in practice means that you would be willing to see someone who has suffered a great loss, like their house being demolished, or like their land being stolen, or like their sons being killed by the Israeli military, and see them behave in ways that you would disapprove of, and you would still say they deserve liberation, and that you would still say they are still in the right because they are not the ones perpetuating the crime. But otherwise, in the framework of humanization, what you're doing essentially is victim blaming by asserting that the victim needs to behave a certain way.
Yeah, okay, that's a perfect segue into the title of the book, Perfect Victims. So can you just describe in very broad strokes what you mean by a perfect victim?
Yeah, I mean, the concept has been kind of studied by the Black radical tradition, by feminist movements, even like, when people use the phrase like good immigrant, bad immigrant, I think all of these things refer to the perfect victim, the demand for you to be perfect. And this perfection, again, is defined by these like parameters that are set forth by the empire and the empire's interest.
Mm-hmm. There's an implication that to be a perfect victim is not only to garner sympathy, but only perfect victims are allowed basic human rights. Why do Palestinians in particular need to be perfect victims?
Because of racism. Yeah, and I think it's quite obvious. There's a refusal to see Palestinians as equal human beings. There's a reluctance to believe that we would have the same reactions to oppression as everybody else. And so the demand becomes, you need to perform a certain affect.
Yeah.
A great example that I love to use here is Christian Amanpour on CNN was interviewing an Israeli author.
Is there a moral maze?
And she was asking him, like, do you agree that, I'm paraphrasing, do you agree that all Palestinians deserve dignity and human rights? And then she quickly pivots, almost correcting herself, and she clarifies.
Everybody has the right to live with rights and dignity, including the Palestinian people. And
Yes.
I am not talking about Hamas.
Yes. And I'm not talking about Hamas. And it is as though they are saying that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights stops short of covering those who they seem politically disagreeable, right? And this would seem like an insane thing to say about any other political party in the world.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine saying everybody deserves freedom and human rights and whatever except Republicans.
Okay, let's move on. Talk about some current events. The ceasefire in Gaza is holding, but just barely. Meanwhile, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, is openly calling for displacing Palestinians from Gaza to neighboring countries, and this is without getting any buy-in from the Palestinians. The complete erasure of the Palestinian perspective. I'd love to know how you're processing all that's happening this week.
It's interesting because I think, the forced displacement of Palestinians, forced transfer of Palestinians, ethnic cleansing, taking over Palestinian land and resources has long been the American project in the region, in addition to upkeeping or maintaining the status quo of military domination over the Middle East. This is U.S. interests in the region. And for Donald Trump to say it so explicitly, it's almost like a mask-off moment. It's also equally heartbreaking to see that Arab nations are saying no to forced displacement, but not saying no to genocide.
That's what the line is, I guess.
Yeah, it's at least good they don't want to take in any refugees, and they don't want Palestinians to be displaced. But they did not do anything about genocide. And also, what's been all the most infuriating to me is I don't understand how there could be 30, 40 journalists in a White House press conference in front of Donald Trump, hearing him say these kinds of crazy things, and not one pushes back on this. No one says, this is not a development plan. You are talking about forced transfer, which is a war crime under international law. I don't understand how they could be that right in front of Netanyahu and hear Trump say, Gaza is a demolition site, and none of them says, the guy who demolished it is right next to you, and you guys financed this demolition. No one says this guy is wanted by ICC. It's like the industry is plagued by spinelessness.
Yeah, it's even just the attitude. There's this, there he goes again. And what he's actually talking about is against international law. It's ethnic cleansing. And everyone dismisses it as like the rantings of, your crazy uncle. But it's the president of the United States.
100%.
One of the things that caught my attention about your new book is the cover illustrations by Maysara Baroud, a Palestinian artist in Gaza. Can you tell me about him, why you chose his art for your book?
Well, I don't know, I'm quite a cynical person in my life, and I need to manually restore my faith every 3 to 5 business days. And I saw, during the genocide that he was working on this series called I Am Still Alive. And when I spoke to him, I learned that he was doing it from inside the displacement camps, from Rafah, from Deir el-Balah, from different tents. He was illustrating from inside the tents against the backdrop of rockets and airstrikes. And I found that, for lack of a better word, very, 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 very inspiring. I really wanted to honor his work. And the illustration itself that I chose it because it resembled like an epic. It almost looked like those old philosophy books. And to me, that's the kind of, I don't want to say this is what I was doing with the book, but this is the kind of conversation I wanted to start with the book. It's a conversation about the human condition. And I think with his epic illustrations, epic drawings, he kind of, and I don't mean epic like as the adjective, in Arabic we say Melhami, like it's, these big battles that he's depicted. I think that was a very suitable direction to go in terms of the cover.
More with Mohammed el-Kurd after the break. Mohammed, you've yourself been asked to play a version of this perfect victim. You've spoken about how you were invited to speak to the European Parliament and the U.S. Congress when you were 11. Can you tell us that story, what it was like then and how you reflect on it now?
It's interesting. I think at the time you think it's kind of like a ego boost. And even for a child, you think, oh, they're interested in what I have to say, and they're inviting me, they're flying me out to speak because I'm such a prodigy or whatever. And then you recognize, no, in fact, there's an insidious industry that operates by platforming children, child advocates, because the audiences to whom they speak are racist and are unwilling to see adult men and women as equal participants in dialogue or in conversation. And it's also quite jarring because you are burdened. It's my experience was not unique. I'm like many Palestinian children. You are burdened with the task of advocacy at a very young age, or you are burdened by the task of rebellion at a very young age, and it says a lot. It also opens up all kinds of difficult questions and conversations about the nature of childhood, and if childhood in New York is the same as childhood in Palestine, and if childhood in a low-income neighborhood in New York is the same as childhood in a wealthy neighborhood in New York, right? It opens up all of these questions about how class and race and geography and politics influence how children develop.
Yeah. And then later in 2021, you had a different experience, right? You were contacted on behalf of some U.S. lawmakers, and it was very different now that you were an adult man. What happened in 2021?
Yeah, they didn't want to talk to me. They wanted me to give them a child to talk to.
Yeah.
I had to
right.
They retired me from my role. It was kind of jarring because then I became the handler of the person. I mean, we didn't give them our children, obviously, but it was like a turning of tables where I then became the fixer who was supposed to provide them with children. And then I understood why it is that they were demanding us to provide them with children to speak to in the first place. But what's almost comical about that experience was that not only did they want a child from Sheikh Jarrah to talk to them, but they wanted the child to come equipped with their vision for peace.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's the most comical aspect.
You wrote, the only Palestinian safe enough to sit at their table is a child. That's what you wrote, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so in theory, children are a sympathetic face, right? Something that resembles this mythic perfect victim. In November 2023, there was a press conference from children in Gaza.
We want to live, we want peace, we want to judge the killers of children. We want medicine, food, and education. and we want to live as the other children live.
So it was heartbreaking to see those kids pleading for their lives. And then subsequently, tens of thousands of children are killed in Israel's war on Gaza, while much of the world just kind of shrugs its shoulders. So how do you explain this?
Well, it dismantles this whole myth that the child is more sympathetic, or like is easier to sympathize with, or that the world cares about children more than they care about adults. In fact, it seemed that those funding and financing and abetting and applauding and coddling the Israeli genocide could not care less who the victims of that genocide were. And, this is proven, again, almost comically. I don't mean to say that this is a funny thing, but the Israelis are such a character of themselves. They're so cartoonishly evil in many ways that it's sometimes hard to not find the humor in it. But a few months, if I'm not mistaken, a few months before the genocide even started, there was a Zionist lobby group in the UK called UK Lawyers for Israel, who threatened to sue a hospital, a children's hospital, I believe, or just a hospital, for displaying children's art made by kids in Gaza on ceramics, alleging that it had made Jewish patients feel unsafe. And the hospital cowardly took that artwork down. How does this targeting of children manifest, or like what does this, if they're targeting the art work of children and calling it unsafe or calling it anti-Semitic, how does this manifest in real life? Well, we've seen it. We've seen various multiple dozens of doctors come back from Gaza, or local doctors in Gaza, who tell us their experiences seeing snipers specifically targeting children in the head. So this kind of insidiousness and hatred towards Palestinian children manifests very, very materially, in the bloodiest ways possible.
Okay, so you say there is a universal relevance to the Palestinian condition, that Palestine is a microcosm of global struggles against oppression. Can you elaborate on that? What is universal, do you think, about this cause that you've spent your life fighting for?
It's the human condition, the rejection of subjugation, rejection of indignity as a state of being. It's quite the essence of the human condition. It's refusal, right? We are a people who do not have an arsenal, or as big of an arsenal. We don't have the privileges or the wealth that is afforded to our oppressors, but we have our refusal. We have the ability to reject the terms and conditions that they set for us. And I think this is emblematic of the human spirit. It's been repeated time after time across history, and it is what has always sparked revolution, and it's what's always changed the world. It's that sense of refusal.
Yeah, and coming back to things like family and the stories you tell, I do feel like there's been a change, right? That we've gone from no representation to at least some representation of the Palestinian point of view. And you've seen when people engage with that perspective, especially young people, they seem to get it. Do you feel that from your perspective in New York?
I mean, I think there is a renaissance right now of Palestinian representation. Maybe I'm in a bubble, but there is like quadruple or so much more times the amount of representation that we had 10 years or 20 years ago. But now the challenge is how do you make representation formative and energizing tool rather than just putting a lens on a humanitarian crisis, which is, I think, the trap that many knowledge producers fall into, which is reducing the Palestinian cause to a humanitarian cause. Of course, there are devastating humanitarian aspects to it, but this is ultimately an anti-colonial cause, a political cause. And the task then is to engage your audience, as willing participants in the struggle, as, critical viewers, because we're going to get a lot of representation. And I think there's a positive correlation, or just a correlation. The more martyrs there are, the more we are going to have opportunities to be represented. But how
Yeah.
how can we be loyal to these martyrs?
Yeah.
And that is through presenting complicated and dignified stories.
The epilogue of your book ends on a note of what I would call hope and resilience. The title is Rain is Coming, which is something your mother used to say, kind of relief from above. Despite it all, are you optimistic?
Yes, I'm well, that's hard.
Yeah.
I am optimistic because I have to be. I believe in the obligation of optimism, right? I think pessimism or nihilism or just plain old giving up, I think that's a luxury that we cannot afford. And also, especially for someone like me who has, a lot more visibility than the average person, I think it would be very selfish to give in to hopelessness. I said earlier that I have to reset my faith manually. So this isn't to say that days are not hard and it's not, it doesn't take a toll on one's mental health. And I can only imagine what's it like for people who are in Gaza or, but at the same time, there is an active element in all of this, which is, the recommitment, everyday recommitment to optimism, because without that, we wouldn't be working. And I think you have to ultimately believe that what Martin Luther King used to say is that the moral arc of the universe bends towards the side of justice. And I do really believe in that.
All right. The book is Perfect Victims, and that's a perfect place to end. Mohammed, thank you very much for coming on The Take today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And that's The Take. We're always listening to what you think of the show. So let us know what kind of episodes you'd like to hear more of and what you thought of this one. And if you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you're going to find all of our recent content, which is updated regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. We'll be back.